Nexus Station Omega-7 existed for one gloriously simple purpose: to prove that the universe had a sense of humor, and that sense of humor was approximately as subtle as a supernova in a teacup. The Hegemony of Strength had constructed their premier trading hub at the intersection of 7 major hyperspace lanes, ostensibly to facilitate commerce between the galaxy's various warrior species. In reality, it served as a cosmic measuring contest where beings from across the known universe could gather to demonstrate just how impressively they could intimidate each other. The station's design philosophy could be summarized as aggressive architecture meets compensatory engineering. Every corridor was built wide enough to accommodate beings whose shoulders could double as landing platforms for small aircraft. The ceilings soared to heights that would give most atmospheric processors vertigo. Even the bathroom facilities had been designed with the understanding that some species required industrial-grade infrastructure for their basic biological functions. This was a place where size mattered, strength ruled, and anyone who suggested that intelligence might be more valuable than the ability to bench press a small moon was quickly educated about the error of their thinking, usually through practical demonstrations involving their skeletal structure and the nearest wall. The Hegemony's membership read like a catalog of everything evolution could produce when it got really excited about creating apex predators. The Vraxians stood 15 feet tall on average and possessed natural armor plating that could deflect anti-tank weaponry. Their idea of casual conversation involved comparing the creative ways they had dismantled their enemies. The Korthak had evolved from some sort of cosmic nightmare that had apparently decided that having retractable claws, acid saliva, and the ability to see in 17 different spectrums wasn't quite enough of an evolutionary advantage. Then there were the luminous, energy-based beings who could exist as pure plasma when the mood struck them, and who considered solid matter to be a quaint phase that less advanced species went through. They communicated through light patterns that could blind anyone foolish enough to look directly at them during an animated discussion about proper combat techniques. The Shaks had somehow managed to evolve crystalline bone structures that could conduct electricity, allowing them to electrocute opponents through direct contact while simultaneously stabbing them with bones that could cut through starship hulls. The Voltax generated their own plasma fields and considered anyone who required external weapons to be disappointingly primitive. All of these magnificently terrifying species gathered on Nexus Station to engage in what the Hegemony politely called dominance protocols, and what everyone else recognized as ritualized violence with a thin veneer of diplomatic courtesy. Disputes were settled through combat. Trade negotiations were concluded through displays of superior firepower. Restaurant reservations were secured through intimidation contests that occasionally required structural repairs to the dining establishments. Supreme War Chancellor Brutus Grimhowl presided over this cosmic circus of controlled chaos from his command throne in the station's central hub. At 15 feet of cybernetically enhanced muscle and artificial weaponry, he represented everything the Hegemony admired about effective leadership. His left arm had been replaced with a plasma cannon that could melt through 6 inches of reinforced durasteel. His right eye was a targeting computer that could track 17 different targets simultaneously. His lower jaw contained retractable combat teeth that he had personally field-tested on the bones of his enemies. Grimhowl had earned his position through the traditional Hegemony method of systematically defeating anyone who disagreed with his qualifications for command. His service record included victories against champion warriors from 43 different species. His tactical expertise had been studied at military academies across 12 star systems. His presence at trade negotiations tended to expedite discussions significantly, partly because of his strategic brilliance and partly because most beings found it difficult to concentrate on complex contract terms while being stared at by someone who could literally bite their heads off. Another profitable quarter. Grimhowl rumbled to his aid, a nervous Korthak whose natural acid production had increased noticeably since accepting the position. I do enjoy watching inferior species recognize their proper place in the natural order. The natural order, according to Hegemony philosophy, was refreshingly straightforward. Large beings dominated smaller ones. Strong species commanded weak ones. Anyone who questioned this arrangement was welcome to discuss their philosophical objections in the combat arena, preferably while wearing protective gear appropriate for high-energy dismemberment. This delightfully simple worldview had functioned beautifully for the Hegemony for several millennia, right up until the moment the human trade delegation had requested docking privileges aboard the merchant vessel Persistent Optimism. The ship itself embodied everything that made the Hegemony species scratch their various appendages in confusion. Where their vessels bristled with weapon arrays designed to announce their occupants' capacity for creative violence, the human craft looked like something designed by accountants who had gotten very excited about fuel efficiency ratings. It was the sort of ship that whispered "we come in peace" while simultaneously suggesting that peace was a business transaction they were surprisingly good at negotiating. Captain Melody Blackwood disembarked with a sort of measured confidence that made larger beings pause just long enough to wonder if they had missed something important during their initial assessment. At 4 feet and 11 inches, she represented everything about human physiology that left other species baffled. Where were the natural weapons? The intimidating bulk? The obvious evolutionary adaptations that any sensible predator species would have developed? The docking bay fell silent as various alien species tried to process what they were observing. Several Vraxian warriors actually bent down to get a better look, apparently convinced that perspective was playing tricks on their optical senses. A group of shacks began emitting harmonic frequencies that their translation matrices identified as barely contained amusement. "Is that supposed to be a fully grown specimen?" asked a particularly large Korthak dockworker, whose acid drool had begun eating through the metal deck plating. "Perhaps they are bringing us their offspring for some sort of cultural exchange program." His companion, a Voltac whose natural plasma field was crackling with what might have been laughter, flickered in patterns that roughly translated to cosmic-scale bewilderment. "Look at the size of it. I've seen emergency rations that posed more of a physical threat." The station's Greeting and Intimidation Committee had prepared standard welcome protocols for visiting dignitaries, which typically involved the display of superior firepower followed by a ceremonial combat demonstration to establish proper hierarchical relationships. The committee members found themselves staring at their procedures manual with the sort of confusion that occurred when reality failed to conform to established protocols. "Perhaps we should skip the intimidation phase," suggested Committee Chair Vextau, a crystalline being whose harmonic voice could shatter reinforced transparent aluminum. "It seems somewhat redundant when dealing with beings who appear to be constructed primarily of optimism and wishful thinking." Melody, meanwhile, was conducting her own assessment of the station's inhabitants with a sort of methodical precision that would have impressed a xenobiological research team if any of them had bothered to notice. She catalogued structural weak points in exoskeleton designs, identified optimal angles for destabilizing beings with high centers of gravity, and mentally calculated the physics required to turn superior size into a tactical disadvantage. It was the kind of analysis that Earth's military academies had been perfecting for centuries, ever since humans had first realized that being the galaxy's least impressive predators meant getting very creative about survival strategies. The station's Cultural Assessment Division had reviewed human physiological data and concluded that the species represented no significant threat to established order. Bone density that wouldn't impress an adolescent Vraxian. Muscle mass that was frankly adorable by galactic standards. Reflexes that were adequate for a species that had probably evolved from something that spent most of its time hiding from real predators. How refreshingly honest, Director Cruex had commented to his staff while reviewing the human files. Most species attempt to inflate their capabilities for diplomatic purposes. The humans seem to understand their limitations and accept their position in the natural hierarchy. The Hegemony's standard procedure for non-threatening species involved what they politely termed protective custody, which essentially meant treating visiting delegations like exotic pets who required supervision to prevent them from accidentally injuring themselves on sharp corners or falling into waste recycling units. Melody found herself assigned to safety escorts, massive alien beings whose job was to ensure that she didn't wander into any of the station's numerous facilities that could accidentally vaporize, crush, or dissolve insufficiently durable life forms. Her escort team included a Vraxian whose footsteps registered on seismic monitoring equipment and a Shax whose crystalline spines could cut through combat armor. "Stay close, little human," rumbled Sergeant Throckdow, the Vraxian escort whose shadow could provide shelter for small aircraft. "This station contains many hazards that could prove fatal to fragile species. We wouldn't want you to accidentally walk into a gravity field or get stepped on by someone who didn't notice you were there." The condescension was so thick it could have been harvested and sold as industrial lubricant. Everywhere Melody went, conversation stopped as various species paused their activities to observe the curious little creature, that had somehow achieved interstellar travel despite appearing to be constructed from materials that most galactic species used for disposable packaging. Adorable, chittered a Arachnoid trader whose 8 legs moved in synchronized patterns that demonstrated his species' natural predatory grace. Do they come in different colors? I'd love to acquire one for my offspring. They'd find it most entertaining. His business partner, an energy-based luminal whose plasma form flickered with amusement, projected light patterns that translated to barely contained cosmic laughter. Careful not to handle it too roughly. I doubt their species has developed adequate durability for normal physical interaction. The station's commercial district had been designed to accommodate beings whose idea of window shopping involved testing product durability by attempting to destroy samples with their natural weaponry. Melody walked through markets where vendors demonstrated the effectiveness of their armor plating by inviting customers to attack them with military-grade weapons. She observed trade negotiations that resembled gladiatorial contests more than business meetings. Fascinating, she murmured to herself, making mental notes about reaction times, combat techniques, and the sort of tactical vulnerabilities that became apparent when warriors were convinced they faced no meaningful opposition. The breaking point came during what should have been a routine trade discussion about establishing regular commercial routes between human space and Hegemony territory. The negotiations were being conducted in the station's primary conference facility, a room designed to accommodate beings whose natural conversation volume could shatter reinforced glass. Melody sat at a negotiation table that had been constructed for species whose average height made basketball players look like children. Her chair had been specially adjusted to allow her to reach the table surface, giving her the appearance of a child attending an adult business meeting. The visual was so absurd that several alien delegates had to activate their translation systems to confirm that she was actually speaking, rather than making the sort of cute noises that most species associated with juvenile vocalizations. The human proposal lacks substance, declared Trade Minister Vraktoth, a massive Korthak whose acid breath was slowly dissolving the conference table's protective coating. Perhaps they should return when they've developed sufficient military capability to engage in serious diplomatic discussions. His colleague, economic advisor Zexnil, a shax whose crystalline structure refracted light in patterns that hurt to look at directly, emitted harmonic frequencies that translated to barely disguised contempt. I suggest we assign them non-voting observer status in the commercial hierarchy. They can watch real species conduct business while learning proper protocols for meaningful participation. The dismissal was so casual, so completely lacking in any recognition of human dignity or capability, that something fundamental shifted in Melody's diplomatic approach. She had spent 3 days being treated like a curious pet, guided around the station like a tourist attraction, and patronized by beings who apparently believed that size was the only meaningful measure of worth in the universe. I propose, Melody said, her voice carrying the sort of calm that experienced negotiators recognized as the moment before things became very interesting, that we settle this matter according to your traditional dominance protocols. The conference room fell silent with the sort of stunned quiet that occurred when small prey animals suggested combat against apex predators. Several alien delegates activated their translation systems multiple times, apparently convinced that their equipment had malfunctioned and produced impossible results. Trade Minister Vraktoth's acid production increased noticeably as he processed what he had heard. Little human, I believe you may have misunderstood our cultural practices. The dominance protocols are combat trials designed for actual warriors. They are not appropriate for diplomatic personnel who lack the necessary physical capabilities for meaningful participation. I understand perfectly, Melody replied with the sort of patient explanation that teachers used when dealing with particularly slow students. If you refuse to recognize human commercial rights through negotiation, then we'll establish them through your preferred method of dispute resolution. The implications rippled through the conference room, with the sort of paradigm-shifting force that made diplomatic protocols require immediate revision. A formal challenge to dominance protocols could not be refused without loss of face, but accepting combat against an opponent who appeared to be constructed from optimism and good intentions seemed like formalized murder. Perhaps, suggested economic advisor Zexnil, his crystalline structure now emitting light patterns that indicated severe cognitive dissonance, we could arrange a modified protocol more appropriate for your species' limitations. Standard protocols will be fine, Melody assured him with the sort of cheerful confidence that made experienced warriors reach for strong beverages. I wouldn't want to impose special accommodations that might invalidate the results. News of the challenge spread through Nexus Station with the sort of viral efficiency that occurred when reality became more entertaining than fiction. Within hours, the station's entire population was aware that a human diplomat had formally challenged the Hegemony's commercial policies through combat trial. Betting pools opened with odds so unfavorable for the human that most gamblers dismissed them as mathematical impossibilities. Supreme War Chancellor Brutus Grimhowl received the news while reviewing tactical reports in his command center. His cybernetic targeting system automatically locked onto the messenger, apparently interpreting the information as some sort of elaborate joke that required aggressive response. "A human has done what?" he asked, his plasma cannon arm beginning to glow with what his aide hoped was amusement rather than preparation for violence. "Challenge Trade Minister Vraktov to formal combat. Sir," the nervous Korthak aide repeated, his natural acid production creating small holes in the deck plating. "The protocols require acceptance or acknowledgement of human commercial superiority." Grimhowl's cybernetic brain processed the tactical implications with a sort of cold efficiency that had made him the Hegemony's supreme military commander. A formal challenge could not be refused, but the visual of a 15-foot cyborg warrior dismantling a 4-foot diplomat would hardly demonstrate Hegemony strength. It would look like institutional bullying taken to cosmic extremes. "I'll handle this personally," he decided, his retractable combat teeth extending slightly as he considered the entertainment value of what would essentially be a brief educational demonstration. The little human deserves to face the Hegemony's finest before learning her proper place in the natural order. The announcement that Supreme War Chancellor Grimhowl would personally conduct the combat trial generated the sort of excitement usually reserved for major astronomical events or declarations of interstellar war. The station's primary arena was open for public viewing, a facility designed to contain the sort of violence that occurred when beings who could level city blocks decided to settle their differences through personal combat. Melody spent her preparation time reviewing tactical analyses with a sort of methodical precision that would have impressed a military strategist if any of the station's inhabitants had considered the possibility that humans might actually possess strategic thinking capabilities. She studied recordings of Grimhowl's previous combat performances, calculated optimal approach angles, and considered the sort of physics problems that occurred when superior size met superior leverage. The arena filled with spectators representing every warrior species in the known galaxy, all of whom had gathered to witness what they expected to be the briefest educational demonstration in interstellar diplomatic history. The betting pools had moved beyond calculating odds of human victory to wagering on exactly how many seconds the combat would last. "This should be over quickly," Grimhowl observed to his technical staff while conducting final systems checks on his cybernetic enhancements. "Perhaps we can schedule the memorial service immediately afterward to avoid unnecessary scheduling conflicts." The arena floor was a standard combat circle, 100 meters in diameter and constructed from materials that could withstand the sort of violence that occurred when weapons-grade lifeforms decided to express philosophical disagreements through physical means. Energy barriers contained the action while providing spectators with excellent views of whatever creative destruction techniques the participants might employ. Grimhowl entered the arena to the sort of reception usually reserved for natural forces or manifestations of divine wrath. His 15 feet of cybernetically enhanced destruction moved with the predatory grace of something that had spent decades perfecting the art of turning opponents into abstract art. His plasma cannon arm could melt through starship armor. His targeting computer could track supersonic projectiles. His combat teeth could bite through materials that most species used for heavy construction. Melody walked onto the arena floor with the unhurried pace of someone who had spent considerable time thinking about momentum transfer equations and the tactical applications of physics. She looked like a child's action figure that had somehow wandered into a gathering of heavy industrial equipment. The size differential was so pronounced that the arena's automated systems briefly malfunctioned, apparently unable to calculate meaningful combat projections for participants whose mass ratios exceeded standard programming parameters. "Little human," Grimhowl rumbled, his voice generating harmonic frequencies that made the arena's structural supports vibrate sympathetically. "You have shown admirable courage in challenging established order. Perhaps you would prefer to concede with honor rather than face inevitable dismemberment." Melody looked up at the towering cyborg with the sort of expression that theoretical physicists wore when presented with particularly interesting equations. "Thank you for the consideration, War Chancellor. I think I'll see how the math works out." "Very well," Grimhowl replied, settling into a combat stance that had been perfected through decades of successful violence. "I shall endeavor to make your educational experience brief and instructive." The combat began with Grimhowl demonstrating why the Hegemony had conquered 17 star systems through the simple expedient of being very good at destroying things that disagreed with them. His opening assault generated energy readings that registered on the station's power grid monitoring systems. His plasma cannon carved furrows in arena flooring that had been designed to withstand orbital bombardment. Melody treated the encounter as a practical examination in applied physics with special emphasis on leverage mechanics and kinetic energy redistribution. She had spent hours studying cybernetic combat footage, calculating optimal strike points, identifying the precise engineering vulnerabilities that 15 feet of weapons-grade destruction might possess. The crucial moment occurred when Grimhowl committed to a combination attack that would have reduced most opponents to their component atoms. His plasma cannon and combat teeth operated in perfect synchronization, delivering enough destructive force to level a small building. It was the sort of devastating assault that had ended thousands of battles across the galaxy. Zara moved with the sort of precision that would have impressed a quantum mechanics professor. She positioned herself at the exact angle required to redirect Grimhowl's considerable momentum through leverage points that turned his massive cybernetic enhancements into critical disadvantages. Her counterattack utilized every principle of physics that human engineers had discovered during their species' long history of defeating things that should have been able to kill them. The 15-foot cyborg left the arena floor with the sort of ballistic trajectory usually associated with artillery shells fired from heavy weapons platforms. He traveled approximately 40 meters before impacting the far wall with enough force to overload the energy barriers designed to contain nuclear explosions. The sound of the impact registered on gravitational monitoring equipment throughout the station. Emergency response teams activated protocols that had never been tested on beings of Grimhowl's size and technological complexity. The arena fell silent with the sort of stunned quiet that occurred when the fundamental laws of physics appeared to require immediate academic review. Grimhowl extracted himself from the wall with the sort of dignified bewilderment that occurred when apex predators encountered tactical concepts that exceeded their theoretical framework. His cybernetic systems were running diagnostic routines, apparently convinced that some sort of massive technical malfunction had occurred. His targeting computer was flashing error messages that indicated its programming had never anticipated scenarios involving successful attacks by beings who registered as negligible threat level. "How?" he asked, his voice carrying the sort of professional curiosity that occurred when military experts encountered techniques that challenged their understanding of battlefield dynamics. Melody brushed dust from her uniform with the casual precision of someone who had just completed a routine training exercise. "Physics, War Chancellor. Your species has focused on maximizing destructive capability, but you haven't really explored the tactical applications of momentum transfer. When you attack something smaller, you're essentially providing that smaller target with tremendous kinetic energy that can be redirected through proper leverage techniques." She gestured toward the Grimhowl-shaped impression in the arena wall. Humans learned a long time ago that size advantages can become tactical vulnerabilities if you understand the underlying mechanics. We've had considerable practice fighting things that were bigger than us. The implications rippled through the arena's spectator sections with the sort of paradigm-shifting force that made military theorists question their fundamental assumptions about warfare. If humans could systematically defeat superior opponents through applied physics rather than brute force, then perhaps the galaxy's understanding of strength required some serious reconsideration. Grimhowl pulled himself upright with the sort of dignified acceptance that professional warriors displayed when forced to acknowledge superior tactics. "I believe," he said carefully while his cybernetic systems finished their damage assessments, "that our commercial negotiations may prove more complex than originally anticipated." The victory ceremony proceeded with appropriate pomp and considerable philosophical confusion. Captain Melody Blackwood was formally recognized as having established human commercial rights within Hegemony territory, making her species the first to achieve equal trading status through combat demonstration rather than military conquest. More importantly, She had accomplished this by proving that the galaxy's most fundamental assumptions about power dynamics might need some serious academic revision. As the ceremony concluded and spectators filed out with the sort of thoughtful expressions that indicated they would be reconsidering several basic life principles, Grimhowl found himself contemplating the broader implications of what he had witnessed. Perhaps strength was not simply a matter of size and destructive capability. Perhaps the smallest warriors were dangerous precisely because they had learned to turn their disadvantages into tactical opportunities. The humans, it seemed, had spent their entire evolutionary history learning how to defeat things that should have been able to kill them instead. And they had gotten remarkably good at it. In the end, Nexus Station Omega-7 had learned a valuable lesson about the dangers of judging species by their physical specifications. The Hegemony of Strength would spend the following years incorporating human tactical doctrine into their military training, discovering that the universe's least impressive predators had developed some truly fascinating theories about combat effectiveness. And somewhere in the station's medical wing, engineering teams were still calculating the exact amount of force required to throw a 15-foot cyborg across a room designed to contain weapons of mass destruction. The math, it turned out, was considerably more complex than anyone had originally anticipated.